Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now if you're anything like me, you're always looking for ways to make your haunt stand out. But sometimes finding low-tech projects with high impact can be challenging. So when friend of the channel Bart Bussey of the Morbid Manor reached out to share a project he'd been working on and suggested I build one for myself, it sounded like the perfect new addition to our haunt. So in this video, I'll be walking you through building the animated raven prop from the Morbid Manor. So let's get to it.
The first thing I'll need for this build is a suitable analog. I found this 15-inch crow with extended wings online that had a large enough body to fit the internal mechanism that will bring this prop to life. But before I could do anything, I'm going to give it a surgery. I'll start by loosely marking off the top area that I'll need to cut away to give me enough room to install all of the parts. I'm using a silver marker, but a piece of chalk would be easier to see. I'll reference the two skewers so that I have a landmark for where the wing joints should be, and will draw my cut line about a 1/4 inch above them. Then I'll draw the rest of my hatch, which was roughly 2.5 inches from top to bottom and 2.5 inches wide. Now that I've got my lines drawn, I can get to cutting out my hatch, and for that I'll be using my rotary tool with a cutoff bit, as well as a face shield for safety. This step can be a bit messy and will remove some of the feathers, but you can always add feathers back at the end. Once my hatch is cut, I'll mark and cut off the corners near the wing joints just to allow for more freedom of movement. This doesn't have to be pretty since it likely won't be seen once everything is reassembled. The last thing to do before moving on to the mechanism is to add a hole in the underside of the body near one of the legs to pass my electrical cord through. And once I'm done doing that, I can set the body aside and get to the mechanism. The mechanism for this build consists of the following parts: a few 3D printed items, including a sliding yoke and crank, a guide rail, and a motor mount, various sizes of hardware, a 5 to 6 RPM synchronous motor, 2 pieces of close hanger wire cut to roughly 10 inches, and a replacement male plug end. With that out of the way, let's get to assembly. I'll start by adding the crank to the motor, since it'll be easier to adjust the position and get the tiny hardware installed before setting it into the motor mount. Not all synchronous motors have this tiny mounting hole, so you'll want to make sure the motor you choose does. And I'll leave a link to all of the parts in the video description should you want to build a raven for yourself. Now that the crank is in place, I can set the motor into the mount, align it with the 2 mounting holes, and secure it in place with 2 1/2-inch screws. Once the motor is mounted, I can move on to the yoke and wire hangers. Off camera, I bent the ends of the wire hangers, which will allow them to wrap around the hardware. This will help to keep them in place, but also give them the ability to move freely. This next piece in the assembly is the yoke. This is what creates the movement. It has a slotted opening that mates with the crank pin, and when the motor is powered, will cause the yoke to slide up and down, which creates the flapping motion. So with the yoke opening set onto the crank pin, and the screws for my wires already inserted, I'll thread one wire through a pivot hole in the motor mount, and then loosely attach it with a nut to the yoke, making sure that the bend in the wire is pointing downward. This connection isn't meant to be tight, it's just there to keep everything in position. And once the first connection's done, I'll repeat the process for the remaining wire. Now that the wires are installed, I can add in the guide rail. It has small notches on the underside that mesh with the motor mount to help with alignment. This piece provides a channel for the yoke to move up and down on, and so the yoke needs to be slid onto that channel before the guide rail can be tightened. You'll also want to make sure that the crank is still in place before tightening everything down. The last thing before we get into installing is to add a plug for our power cord and test out the mechanism. To do this, I'll be using this replacement plug end. I'll squeeze the prongs together to remove it from the housing, then I'll feed the cord through the opening in the back. Next, I'll spread the prongs to expose the small spikes, place the ends of my cord into the openings below the prongs, making sure to push them as far in as they'll go, and then squeeze the prongs together and insert it back into the housing. With that squared away, it's time to test. Everything seems to be working, so let's do this last bit of prep on the Raven and then we'll get the motor set in place. My Raven's legs were in the way of the mechanism, so I cut them down to make room for it. Then I did a quick test fit, but found that the area around the wings was a bit loose. So I decided to add a bit of 5mm EVA foam to the mount with some contact cement to help give it a more snug fit. This would also allow me the ability to remove everything should I ever need to make repairs. Off camera, I reinstalled the mechanism and cut down the wing wire so that roughly 3.5 inches remained outside the body. I also removed the plug end, threaded the cord through the hole I made earlier, and reattached the plug. Now that the motor is in place, I can attach the wings. These wings have a foam core, so I measured about a 1/2 inch from the front edge and just pressed them into position. These fit pretty snug, but you may want to use a bit of foam glue to make the connection more permanent. The last bit of housekeeping is to reattach the hatch. Since I want to be able to access everything, I've decided to use a bit of Velcro to keep things in place. So I stuck the two pieces together, peeled away the backing paper from one, and stuck it to the motor mount. Then I peeled away the remaining backing paper and pressed the hatch onto it to make sure the alignment was correct. I'll go back and hot glue some additional feathers to hide the edges of the hatch, but for now, it's time to see it in action.
Now, if you've ever considered building animated props for your haunt but thought it might be a bit too difficult, this may be the project for you. It's a straightforward build with minimal parts that might just be the thing to help you gain a bit of animatronic confidence. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.